For those joining, we're going to give it another minute or two here so that we are ready to go and everyone's been able to log on successfully. All right, it is 2:02, so I think we're going to get started. We have some housekeeping items to go through anyway, in case we have a few members from the press who are running late. Good afternoon, I'm Barbara Berrigan-Perea, and I'll be moderating this afternoon's online press seminar, Harmful Algal Blooms in California Waters. Today, we're going to be examining how harmful algal blooms in the Bay Delta watershed and its tributaries impact California tribes, communities, and the environment, including both air and water quality, both for humans and wildlife. Before we move ahead with introductions, we have a few housekeeping items to share with everyone. Please first type your questions for the panelists in the chat. And when presentations are completed, we will have time for questions, and Mariah Looney will be helping us by reading those questions out. Press gets to go before any agency participants. This press seminar will be available for review by close of business at the latest tomorrow, September 14th on YouTube. While our panelists are experts in their areas and are really great communicators, this subject is detailed and filled with jargon. So I want to review quickly a few terms so that when we inadvertently use technical jargon, the press and other guests will be able to follow along. HABs is shorthand for harmful algal blooms. TBUs is shorthand for tribal beneficial uses. In this conversation, discharge is going to be a discussion for nutrient discharge or nutrient load. Non-limiting nutrient load means a reduction in nutrients, which will not change outcomes because nutrient loads are constant. This applies to any discussions about Stockton in particular and not the Bay Area. Secondary aerosols are not toxins, but chemical compounds emitted into the air. And CFS stands for cubic feet per second. So hopefully that'll help keep everybody straight and on the same page. Our speakers today are James Sarmento with the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians. James Sarmento, who is also part of the Shasta tribe. He received his doctorate in Native American Studies from the University of California, Davis, and Dr. Sarmento currently works as the Executive Director of Cultural Resources for the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians. After that, you'll hear from Spencer Fern, who is the Delta Science Program Manager for Restore the Delta. Spencer received his degree in microbiology from Cal State University, Monterey Bay. He currently leads Restore the Delta's field testing and research program with a team of climate water advocates who are university students with STEM majors from the Delta region. Ian Wren manages advocacy and research efforts. He provides technical hydrology services at Baykeeper's enforcement actions, and he regularly represents Baykeeper before regulators, municipalities, and technical committees. He studied biology and ecology at UC Berkeley, and he holds a master's in hydrology and sustainable development from Imperial College in London. Zach Chigone is an environmental scientist for the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians. His work focuses on water quality testing and analysis, especially focusing on the threats of harmful algal blooms and E. coli bacteria. Prior to starting his position in March of 2023, he earned an MS in Natural Resources from Cal Poly Humboldt. Haley Plass, who is joining us today from North Carolina, is a doctoral student at UNC Chapel Hill. Her research focuses on the impact of harmful algal blooms on air quality and ecologically diverse watersheds. Excuse me. Our first speaker today is Dr. Sarmento with the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians, who will describe the links between harmful algal blooms on air quality in ecologically diverse watersheds. And panelists, if you can, you probably want to make yourself visible on the screens, on your screens now, and just keep yourself muted until it's probably time to talk. So James, you are still, if you need to unmute, it looks like, and you are ready to go.
There we go. Can you hear me okay? I always feel like that's the first where everybody starts anyways, whether or not you can hear one another. So Second scene, my name is James Sarmento, and I'm the Executive Director for the Cultural Resources Division at Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians. Want to talk a little bit about the Delta. The Delta is, central to the identity of the Shingle Springs and other tribal communities in and around the Delta region. So water is extraordinarily important. So tribes continue to look towards the Delta and the water for livelihood, ecological knowledge, ceremony, and spirituality, and their heritage. The tribe's concern with water quality in that area has actually led Shingle Springs to develop a more robust water program that utilizes both Western science and traditional ecological knowledge to understand the world and to continue to steward the waterways, which it has done since time immemorial. And Zach will speak more about this later, so I'm going to let him do a bulk of the work there. One of those concerns is harmful algal blooms, which has had a negative impact on tribal beneficial uses. Some of those impacts include impacts on traditional ceremonies held at the waterways, fish consumption, plant life that is used for making baskets and regalia. We've recently had several events that have canceled from concerns about the water quality in the vicinity, where tribal members are either practicing ceremony or practicing just sort of normal recreational activities. Being able to have events and ceremonies and be active on the water is extraordinarily important for that transfer of knowledge, that tribal knowledge from elders to tribal youth. And poor water quality often disrupts this because the tribal members are no longer able to interact in those ways that they need to. And I will yield the rest of my time, certainly to the rest of the panelists, who will be able to definitely describe way more technical jargon than I could ever come up with what's actually happening on the riverways. But it's been detrimental for tribal communities, and I think that everything that they present speaks towards that. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for making the connection for everyone on how harmful algal blooms actually directly impact tribal practices and tribal culture. Next, we're going to turn to a presentation by Spencer Fern, and he will take it away to talk about new data on flows in the Delta.
Hello, everyone, and I've got a presentation that I'm sure will be queued up pretty soon. But yeah, everyone, I kind of already was mentioned, but my name is Spencer Fern, and I am the Delta Science Program Manager for Restore the Delta. And the focus of my work has been on this freshwater harmful algal bloom problem that we've been seeing across the San Francisco Bay Delta and estuary. And I do oversee a monitoring program that I run with some of our interns to look into microcystis which is the dominant source of harmful algal blooms in Stockton. And it's helping to fill in the data gaps for the State Water Board on the HABs incident reports map, which is should have been forwarded to you through the press release as a reference guide. The monitoring program, before it was set up, there wasn't very much reporting on harmful algal blooms, and it was rather incomplete. And I want to thank all of you for coming to this HABs Media Symposium to help spread the word on harmful algal blooms. And as you'll see on the screen in front of you, the Sacramento River up at the top in the north is where Shingle Springs, on the confluence of the Sacramento River and the Feather River, is where they will be testing and show their data from. And then on the bottom line, where you see where Stockton is and where that's circled, is where we test from. And I just kind of wanted to give a geographical context for where we are in this system. But with that context in mind, I want to kind of go over the observations that we have found in Stockton during the last 2 testing years. So last year, during the summer months from April till about August, September, we saw harmful algal bloom outbreaks at the end of the Smith Canal from late May to early June, and at McLeod Lake, which is near downtown Stockton in the deep water shipping channel of Stockton, for the whole month of August. And this was all in 2022. And these were characterized by the bright neon green mats that formed and were releasing toxins at cautionary to dangerous levels based on the guidelines provided by the FHAB program, which is where the monitoring map is, then what we provide our data towards. So the difference here is this year, we didn't see a single harmful algal bloom outbreak at any of the sites we tested around Stockton. And that's even going into September. So the question is, what's so different about this year compared to last year? And HABs are driven by a few factors, and those factors that will include nutrient availability, water temperature, light availability, and stagnant water. Now, nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen are in high supply in the deep water shipping channel of Stockton, which is one of the contributing factors in harmful algal bloom outbreaks. And then water temperatures that microcystis thrive in, they range from 77 to about 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Light availability is what it sounds like, where it's the amount of sunlight that the algae thrives on is available and helps them grow. And then lastly, of course, there's the stagnant water, which helps a bloom form across an entire water body and spread, which is due to low flow conditions and can be induced by low flow conditions. Now, compared to last year, nutrient availability and light availability haven't changed much, if at all, in Stockton. Temperature has been lower this summer, but water temperatures during the expected bloom times, so we're talking about June, July, August, we're sitting around 77 to 81 degrees Fahrenheit, which is within a conducive temperature for microcystis to outbreak. However, the biggest difference between this year and last year is the sheer volume of downstream flow that has come as a result of snowpack. And I have some slides prepared with flow charts, and these charts are available in the reference sheet that I sent you all. But if I could get to the next slide, we'll kind of go over these flow charts. So these flow charts were generated using the California Data Exchange Center, or CDEC for short, to show flow scales between wet years in 2019 and 2023 specifically, and compare those with drought years between 2020 and 2022. And as you'll see on each of these graphs, aside from one, and you'll see that one coming up, there's a red line that shows when a first harmful algal bloom was reported in Stockton based from a state agency report. So I want to kind of point out and mention here that how in 2019 this is a high flow year because we had a wet year. And we reached a peak of about 8,850 cubic feet per second in about between June 2nd and June 9th. But we see high flow all the way through about June 30th when it starts to fluctuate up and down between 3,000 and 4, or between positive and negative 4,000 cubic feet per second. And then that's when the bloom was first reported around Labor Day. And it's important to explain what those values mean, where the positive values are downstream flow. So downstream flow is implying that water is coming from the Sierras in the event of snowpack melt throughout the summer months. And then when you start to see it go negative, that is upstream flow. And upstream flow and the fluctuation between the two tends to imply tidal movement of the waters. So as the tidal patterns of the moon going up and down and changing the tidal patterns for the waterways. Now I'm going to kind of jet through the next three, but just I'll point out 2020 real quick if I can get to the next slide. So 2020 is on a different scale than the last one. Of course, it was a drought year, and we see that the flow is between 4,000 and negative 4,000 flow there. And we see our first reported bloom somewhere around the 2nd or 3rd of June. And that was when we first saw a bloom there, which was kind of a low flow dictated by that tidal movement of upstream and downstream flow with tidal patterns. And you'll see a similar trend in 2021 on the next slide, with low flow this time between about 3,500 and positive and negative, and going back and forth between those kind of fluctuated amounts. And then you'll see the bloom was first reported around that same time frame, around the 2nd of June, a little bit prior to that. And then in 2022, we had our worst flow year, at least in the early months of summer, around that April to about July phase, where you see harmful algal bloom broke out just a tiny bit earlier than previous years, in the 25th around of May, where we saw low flow throughout the entire time and a drought year. Now, with all of those in mind, and knowing that 4,000 to negative 4,000 seems to be that like trigger point for harmful algal blooms, I kind of want to take you into 2023. And in 2023, not only did we have a higher peak flow through the early summer months all the way into about June, but the peak was rather high at 12,500. And you see that fluctuation kind of didn't really ever happen until we start to get towards the current months. And mind you, I should still mention, we still haven't seen a harmful algal bloom in Stockton. But all of this flow, which seems to have come from snowpack melt, is helping to mitigate this harmful algal bloom outbreak that we've had to deal with for previous years in the Stockton area. And with this context in mind, it's one of the few factors that state agencies can actually control. So the argument we're trying to make is that increasing flow during those drought years and creating more freshwater, cool flow to come through the main stem of the San Joaquin River is very pivotal in managing this harmful algal bloom problem. And with that in mind, that is pretty much it with what we deal with in Stockton, with our nutrients that we have that are problems and are always in high supply. The real thing we can manage is this flow. And I've been speaking on this harmful algal bloom problem from a freshwater standpoint, but there are different types of harmful algal blooms, and in saltwater, specifically in the form of red tides. And I'll pass it on to our next speaker, who will go over this, but thank you.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for your interest in this topic. My name is Ian Wren. I'm the staff scientist at San Francisco Baykeeper, and I'm deeply involved in issues related to nutrient management and the health of San Francisco Bay overall. As my colleagues are describing to you today, the Delta grapples with significant and distinct water quality challenges, setting it apart from the emerging harmful algae issues we're seeing here in San Francisco Bay. This is partly due to differences in the drivers of how algal blooms get initiated. As Spencer described, algal blooms tend to flourish in waterways characterized by elevated nutrient levels, abundant sunlight, and tranquil conditions with minimal wind and waves. In the Delta, water flow is a critical factor under the control of managers and offers a means to mitigate bloom formation. Flow management, however, is not a tool that's available in the Bay, which is less influenced by freshwater flows. In the Bay, a primary lever to combat blooms lies in reducing nutrient loading from municipal wastewater, which is the primary source of nutrient enrichment, things like nitrogen and phosphorus. This form of pollution originates from the dozens of treatment plants that discharge nutrient-rich treated wastewater into the Bay, which is sourced from the millions of homes and businesses across the region. In stark contrast, the Delta has seen improvements in municipal wastewater plants in Stockton and Sacramento, reducing nutrient loads. However, it appears that other factors like sufficient freshwater flow is contributing to the persistence of harmful algal blooms in that region during low flow years. Following last year's unprecedented algal bloom that affected nearly all of San Francisco Bay and claimed countless fish, including our iconic white and green sturgeon, both regulators and the wastewater community have come to the collective realization of the need to curtail nutrient loads to the Bay. Just this morning, advocates from the Sierra Club and Baykeeper rallied before the San Francisco Bay Water Quality Control Board, urging them to compel wastewater agencies in the Bay Area to take action in reducing nutrient loads to the Bay. Some agencies have already risen to the challenge, planning ambitious load reductions, yet others are slow to unveil concrete plans or their intentions to reduce nutrient inputs to the Bay. We applaud the wastewater managers taking proactive steps to mitigate the formation of harmful algal blooms, but we know regulatory action is needed to ensure fair and consistent adoption of potentially costly wastewater treatment upgrades. San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board has stated its intent to do just that, and we urge swift adoption of permit requirements to put our region back on track to reduce the harmful effects of nutrient over-enrichment. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for jumping in. We were having some technical problems here, Ian, and thanks for explaining the differences and what's happening currently in the San Francisco Bay. Next is Zach Chigon from the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians to discuss the Shingle Springs testing program and harmful algal blooms identification through that program.
Thank you, Barbara. Hi, everyone. My name is Zach Jagone, and I am an environmental scientist with the Shingle Springs Band. And part of my job involves dealing with the threat of harmful algal blooms. I've been conducting regular testing for HABs in order to be aware of potential threats and preparations for activities conducted by the tribe and ceremonies that they conduct. So specifically, this is to target potential harm to tribal kids or tribal elders when they're at these activities, as well as potentially pets who could be getting in the water and ingesting some of these harmful algal blooms. And we also are concerned about the potential of aerosolized contamination, which we'll hear more about from our next speaker. And although during this season, none of my tests have most of the tests have not tested positive for harmful algal blooms. There have been one instance where cyanotoxins resulting from harmful algal blooms were detected and resulted in a tribal event needing to be canceled due to the potential harm from those. And additionally, previous testing conducted by the State Water Board has found HABs that have been a problem, pretty large blooms in several of the tribe's ancestral sites where I'm currently testing at. So we are concerned that this could continue to be a problem into the future. So as we're dealing with these threats, many of the locations along the Sacramento River disproportionately affect both tribal communities as well as various other disadvantaged communities located in the Sacramento area. And many of the communities that are most strongly affected by these do not have the resources that are required in order to deal with them and to understand the testing and stuff that's required in order to be able to understand what's happening. So with all the factors that are affecting HABs, such as flow regimes, temperatures, nutrient levels, and all these other aspects, addressing these issues is becoming increasingly important in order to protect tribal communities, as well as all of the communities that are affected by this issue. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for the update on your program. Rounding out our discussion today with panelists is Haley Plass from the University of North Carolina. And she is going to discuss the result of their research conducted in the Delta and the connections between harmful algal blooms and air pollution.
Great. Thank you so much, Barbara. So as mentioned, my name is Haley Plaus. I'm a PhD candidate working with Hans Pearl at UNC Chapel Hill. And our team of researchers has been working in the Delta for the last 2 summers, specifically in Stockton and Discovery Bay. And we've been examining the potential impacts that blue-green algae, these freshwater blooms, have on air quality. So we've been looking for the toxins and other compounds that originate from these blooms, and we've been looking for them in aerosol, which are microscopic particles that are floating in the air, and they are unhealthy to breathe no matter what they are comprised of. So during summer 2022, we did not find any cyanotoxins such as microcystin or anatoxin in the air. However, we did find that other compounds produced by these blooms, called taste and odor compounds, can lead to aerosol formation. So this is the phenomenon that's depicted on the slide that you're viewing. We found that one taste and odor compound specifically, which starts off as a gas emitted from the blooms and evaporates into the atmosphere. Once it gets into the atmosphere, it undergoes a series of chemical reactions that can turn that gas into an aerosol particle, which is then what would be unhealthy to inhale. So we don't yet know to what extent that this is happening across the Delta or in other watersheds. And we also don't know the specific health risk associated with inhaling these compounds. But we do know that inhaling aerosol in general is not good for your respiratory health. And this suggests that these blooms could be impacting individuals who are not coming in direct contact with the water. And it also suggests that these blooms should continuously be regarded as both a water quality and air quality issue. So if you want more specific information on the study that we conducted, a scientific publication with our findings should have been provided in the press release. So thank you for being here, and I'm very excited to interact with you, and I'm happy to answer questions when the time comes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are ready for questions now. One thing I'd like to, just round out is that where Haley's research at the University of North Carolina is taking place in Stockton. This is an AB 617 community. It is a community that is really highly impacted by multiple sources of air pollution. So anything that adds to it is pretty disturbing for us. We have one of the highest rates of asthma in the United States in this particular community that's impacted by harmful algal blooms. So we have questions, and I believe Mariah will unmute herself. You'll hear her voice if there are questions from the press. Okay, at the moment, it doesn't seem that we have any. We'll give it a second here. Do any of the panelists have any questions for each other while we wait? Okay. All right, we have a few questions coming in here, so.
Give me just a moment.
Take the question. Okay. All right. Again, we're having a little bit of a technical challenge. We apologize. First question is from Nancy Perlman with EC News. Who's funding this research? So I think maybe if everyone could go through and talk about how they're kind of scraping together, I think paying for the research. Spencer, I see you first, so I'm going to have you start.
Totally fair. So yeah, with our testing program, which involves grabbing water samples to test with Abraxas test strips and send samples off to a lab, we're getting that funding / supplies from the state water board, or more specifically the Region 5 water board for the water quality board over there. So they've been helping us set up and test around. Otherwise, we also get funding through grants. I'm not sure if specific which ones, but there's a few different ones that we're that I'm paid for to do this work, essentially.
In particular, in Stockton, this work comes in as the funding comes in as economic development work for university students as a result of the James Irvine Foundation. And sadly, what we haven't been able to really get our hands on is the full kind of state support we need for federal for testing. We've tried a few rounds and things are competitive and they just haven't exactly worked out. And we think that that kind of shows that there is not a fully developed understanding of what an emerging health threat HABs are for this region. Haley, do you want to describe a little bit about how your program gets funded at UNC?
Yes, so this project in the Delta specifically is funded by the Delta Science Program, which is a joint program between the Delta Stewardship Council and California Sea Grant. So that's our primary source of funding for this project. But we also have supplemental funding from North Carolina Sea Grant and the National Science Foundation that has helped us with our work out there.
Great. James or Zach, is your program self-funded?
I can speak to that. Yeah, we are mostly funded by the tribe itself, but I have also been provided some of the Abraxas tests that Spencer mentioned from Restore the Delta, as well as from the State Water Board.
Great, thank you. And Ian, is your work on this all grant driven?
Yes, the work on behalf of Baykeeper is, although much of the research that's done in the Bay Area is funded by permit fees administered through the water board and derived from municipal wastewater agencies.
Okay, very good. We have a second question here from Nancy. I wanted to see if we have anything else. Anyone else asking another question before I move forward?
Where else in the state are HABs a problem?
Great. There's a question here as to where else in the state HABs are a particular problem. Ian or Spencer, Zach, do you want to pipe in with that?
I'm happy to start. I mean, I think it's becoming a persistent problem throughout the state and frankly the world. We see places like Clear Lake have been a long-term kind of hot spot. There's all the reservoirs around the Bay Area, and as well as in Southern California and in the Central Valley. And we routinely have shellfish advisories along the coast. So it seems like it's really happening all the time, and just seems to be, we're getting more and more water quality impairments throughout the state for various forms of harmful algae, but it's not unique to California. It's happening worldwide.
And I guess I'll just jump off from where he left off and say that, yeah, it's really a statewide problem, but there are varying degrees of severity throughout the state. And for instance, I know Stockton hasn't had any harmful algal blooms this year, but I know Discovery Bay has, and there are a few other sites around. And Clear Lake always tends to get theirs each year, but it's always those areas of water where it kind of dead ends, where you've got dead end water parts where water doesn't flow in as well, or temperatures are increasingly high in that area. Sunlight is beating down on the water bodies, and nutrients are able to load those same types of water ends. But even recently, I saw an article about toxins making their way down to Pyramid Lake near LA, which is kind of close to one of the tunnel outtake or intakes from the top or as a reservoir. So I mean, toxins are moving all throughout California, and it's a statewide problem at this point, which I mean is very accentuated in the Delta, but it's increasingly getting worse over the years.
I think it's worth pointing out the Klamath River has repeatedly had trouble and they're having problems again this year. Part of it has been tied to what's happened behind dams, but then when they have extremely low flow conditions on the rivers directly, they seem to have a significant problem. Zach or James, is there anything you want to add about up north? Because I'm going to talk then about the FHAB report, the freshwater HAB report.
I mean, I could certainly talk about like the Copco Lake and the Klamath for sure. That definitely every year is just it's terrible. I don't know how to describe it because that's where I'm from. So for me, I've seen that way since I was a kid, and it's only gotten worse. So I don't fish there. In that area, but I'm happy to see the dams being removed, and that'll change the flows and change some of the other dynamics of that particular area when you were talking about that. I think the tribe Shingle Springs concerns are certainly where we're having tribal members doing events. So anywhere where we're starting to see events and gathering areas. So it's not just like, I think it's a misnomer. It's a misunderstanding that that the tribe is only concerned about sort of tribal lands being rancheria reservation lands. It is the tribe's traditional area that it is really concerned with, where tribal members are still currently participating in ceremony and still currently participating in gathering materials. So you'll see, I think Zach pointed this out, and I think it was pointed out on the map. So the Sacramento area, the confluence of the rivers, Stone Lakes, various other places where you're having just lots of water is starting to pause in some places, and it's concerning.
I'd like to add that there's the freshwater HAB map that is available and is updated weekly by the water boards, California water boards. And it really shows how much testing is being done throughout the state by groups like ours, by tribes, by other parties. They're all loading the data in with the state. We are seeing outbreaks regularly in reservoirs, which of course then is a concern for drinking water uses for larger populations. Then you have the potential, especially on Klamath and some of the rivers, even in Stockton and the Delta. When these blooms dissipate, they create a problem called dissolved oxygens, which helps kill off fish populations. And that is another additional problem from it. And the cyanotoxins always also load up in fish tissue, which makes consumption problematic. We have learned recently that the Asian clams in the Delta are being tested for the potential to see how cyanotoxins load into, or have been recently loaded into the tissue of those clams. And we did not know, but we learned that environmental justice communities are gathering those clams to actually make soup with them. So there's another layer of a public health threat with it. So we encourage press members and people and members of the public to always stay on top of tracking where they are with the freshwater HAB map that's available at the State Water Resources Control Board site. I mean, additional questions?
There's one in the Q&A.
Okay. This is for James. How many years would you say that algal blooms have gotten in the way of tribal events, or at least been an impediment?
That's a difficult question to answer, in part because testing and data hasn't been there for past years, and we've not had a lot of we've had lots of tribal members in those spaces, so it's hard. In terms of canceled events, would be the last, for sure, last year and probably last 2 years, where we can say where we specifically made, where we were specifically aware of the data ahead of time, and we were able to uh, make changes immediately. So, and that is largely thanks to, and I'm going to call this young man out, Zach, really doing a good job in making sure that when we were having tribal events, we are now actually incorporating his research and his information into how we're planning it. So it really only the last couple of years has that data actually been available for us to be able to implement on.
I would add to that, at our end of the Delta, we've had 2 years of a science-based testing program. Before that, we had a let's run around and take photos program for about 5 or 6 years. So it's interesting because we start with that chart in 2019, which was a high flow year. And it took me weeks to remember this, but in particular in 2019, where we had high water flows, and it's reported with the state, the first bloom happened right around Labor Day. The truth is it happened many months before that, but there wasn't regular testing for this area. And it wasn't until we started complaining in 2019 that regular testing and observations started in 2020, we believe. So I think that some of these challenges have been going on much longer. Anecdotally, I can remember years, the Delta turning bright green, but it wasn't being tracked, and we were pushing for help and how to handle this problem and to start documenting it. And so, Ian, I have the same question for you. Is there a longer history than the last couple of years of the kind of bloom problem that you're experiencing in the San Francisco Bay, or has it been intermittent?
Well, I mean, researchers at SF State and UCSC have tracked the fact that the bay is kind of considered a mixing pond of lots of different types of harmful algae, kind of given its historic role as a shipping hub, and a lot of invasive species have come and gone. But they've never seen full-blown blooms like the one that happened last year, which is attributed to a species called Heterosigma akashiwo. There's been a couple smaller blooms dating back a couple decades, and that species does pop up in routine surveys, but yeah, we've never seen anything like we saw last year.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the questions that Nancy had typed in is that one of the maps showed area covered going into 2 main rivers. How is it decided to do the research? And I think we've kind of answered that because, for Shingle Springs and James or Zach, you can please correct me. I think the answer is you're really focusing on areas throughout the watershed in the Delta, north of the Delta, that are really important. And that's the legal Delta, not as the tribe defines the Delta. But you're really investigating sites that are areas where people are accessing water from the tribal community and from related communities in the area.
And I'd like to add on to that just real quick and say that at least in determining where to do the research, at least along those rivers and different waterways within the Delta, it's hard to get people to search or start the research in those areas because of the lack of funding when it comes from either state resources or any of those matters. I mean, half of what we do at Restore the Delta is, I mean, mind you, it's funded by a different grant, but it's still in-house money that we're using to set up this program. And I'm sure Zach can attest to some of the things that he's set up is in-house. And so there is another means in which that the people can kind of attest or add on to this monitoring program, at least, which is just to report visual observations of blooms. And so what I think is incredible about having press in this meeting is that we can get this word out about the different types of harmful algal blooms we see throughout the entirety of the Bay or the Delta, and increase it in the minds of people who are reading the stories that you guys publish, and then they can then go and take what knowledge that they've learned from this and then report what they see and help create a better network to get more, task forces from either the State Water Board or either other nonprofit organizations that want to start up a testing program from what they've seen in their own communities.
But great observation. I think we are probably close to being finished there. Have we finished with all the questions? One last one. Let me see. All right. I'm not seeing it. I think I grabbed it.
I think it was Nancy asking about what is happening with this type of research in Southern California. And that one, I admit, I have only really been looking at the Delta as a Delta-wide kind of management. I don't know if anybody else has any updates on LA or SoCal.
PWR Metropolitan Water District have been keeping track of their reservoirs, and actually some of the people we work with from the Regional Water Board were really involved with good program from USC that was tracking harmful algal blooms in that area. And there's also a lot of good research and tracking that comes out of programs attached to UC Santa Cruz as well. So from mid-state to Southern California, I actually think they were ahead of us, ironically, even though in some ways we've been more heavily impacted, I think. But I kind of see more of a focus throughout the state that's probably a little bit more even-handed now, maybe than 5, 6, 7 years ago. James, did you have something to add?
I think you already got it. I was just going to make sure that you got the question there. Sorry about that.
Okay.
The only thing I would add on to that would be that tribes are often, in terms of their programs, are either reservation or rancheria centric, and it's only when tribes have capacity to be able to look at their larger tribal ancestral area. So I would say that their data is probably not as robust as something like what we have at Shingle Springs. So Shingle Springs is, I would say, an outlier and ahead in some respects. Zach can definitely speak more to that. I would say that that's a pretty unique situation, at least for the Sacramento area. I don't know that it's echoed down south or further north in the same kinds of ways that it is.
I would add to that actually Restore the Delta is really indebted to the Karuk tribe and to Sarah Ryan in the Clear Lake area. In fact, Sarah Ryan helped train us, and she was the one that kickstarted us to get a program together. She kind of sat me down in a room and said, "This is what you have to do. You can't just take photos." So it was based on their training that we kind of were able to move forward. So we're very grateful to the tribal communities that have been collecting data up north. And we're so glad that Shingle Springs is now at that level also doing the same kind of work. All right, I think that's going to conclude for today. This will be up on YouTube by close of business tomorrow. And if anyone from the press needs anything, please feel free to contact us. Thank you. And thank you to all the panelists.